Imagine you are 24,000 feet in the air. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero, so cold your breath turns to ice inside your oxygen mask. Below you, the city of Bremen is a map of fire and steel. Around you, the sky is filled with black clouds of flak and the screaming engines of Messerschmitts. Then, the unthinkable happens. A 20-millimeter cannon shell tears through the spine of your B-17 Flying Fortress. There's a shriek of metal so loud it drowns out the engines. In a heartbeat, the plane, your home, your only protection, simply snaps. The cockpit, the wings, and 9 of your brothers vanish into the clouds, plummeting toward the earth. You are left in the tail section, a jagged 20-foot chunk of aluminum severed from the rest of the world. No wings, no engines, no pilot, just you, your twin 50-caliber machine guns, in a 4-mile drop to the German soil below. Most men would close their eyes. Most men would pray for a quick end. But Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran wasn't most men. As his flying coffin tumbled end over end through the freezing sky, Moran didn't reach for a parachute. He knew his parachute was shredded by shrapnel. He knew he was already a dead man. So, with the wind howling through the open end of his severed tail and the ground rushing up at terminal velocity, Eugene Moran did the only thing a Wisconsin farm boy knew how to do. He gripped the triggers of his guns, and he kept shooting. This is the impossible true story of the man who fell 4 miles without a parachute, fought a dogfight while falling to his death, and survived to tell the tale. This isn't just a story of war, it's a story of a human spirit that refused to break even when the laws of physics said it was over. How did he survive the impact? What did the Germans do when they found a man alive in a pile of scrap metal? And why did he keep his silence for 60 years? Today, we're going inside the tail section of the Rikki-Tikki-Tavi to witness the most miraculous survival in the history of the Second World War.
To understand how Eugene Moran survived, you first have to understand the metal trap he lived in. In 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortress was the queen of the skies, but she was a cruel mistress. It carried 10 men, but none were as isolated as the tail gunner. Eugene was only 19 years old. Just months prior, he was milking cows on a dairy farm in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. Now, he was 40 feet away from the rest of his crew, crouched on a bicycle-style seat in a compartment so small he couldn't even wear his parachute. It had to be stowed nearby, a canvas bag of hope that felt miles away when the fighters started their 12 o'clock high runs. The tail gunner's job was simple: be the last line of defense. German pilots were sharks. They looked for the blind spots. They knew that if they attacked from directly behind, they only had to face one man. Eugene Moran was that man. On the morning of November 29, 1943, the mission was Bremen. It was a milk run to hell. The 8th Air Force sent 300 bombers into the teeth of the German industrial heartland. For Eugene, this was his first real taste of the meat grinder. He watched the formation, a combat box designed to overlap fire. It looked invincible on paper. In reality, it was a target-rich environment for the Luftwaffe. As they crossed the North Sea, the cold began to bite. At 24,000 feet, the air is so thin it starves the brain of logic. Eugene's electrically heated suit was the only thing keeping him from turning into a statue. He adjusted his goggles, squinting into the sun. That's when he saw them, small black specks on the horizon. Hornets. "Fighters! 6 o'clock!" he would have shouted over the intercom. But the intercom was already beginning to crackle with the sounds of other gunners screaming out coordinates. The air was suddenly filled with tracers, long glowing fingers of death reaching out from the German planes. Eugene gripped the handles of his twin 50s. The vibration of the bomber's four Wright Cyclone engines hummed through his boots, but he was focused on the silhouettes, Focke-Wulf 190s, the Butcher Bird. They didn't just fire bullets, they fired 20mm cannons that turned B-17 aluminum into confetti. The Rikki-Tikki-Tavi groaned as it entered the flak zone. The sky turned black with oily smoke. Each explosion sent a shockwave through the tail, tossing Eugene around like a doll. He saw a B-17 to his left take a direct hit to the bomb bay. It didn't fall, it vanished in a ball of orange flame. No chutes, 10 men gone in a microsecond. Eugene didn't have time to mourn. His first Focke-Wulf was diving. He led the target, compensating for the 200-mile-per-hour wind, and squeezed. The heavy machine guns thudded against his chest. This was the start of the longest hour of his life.
The Rikki-Tikki-Tavi had just dropped its payload. 4,000 pounds of high explosives were tumbling toward the shipyards of Bremen. The pilot, a man Eugene trusted with his life, began the slow, heavy bank to turn the formation back toward England. "Bombs away!" the bombardier called out. It should have been a moment of relief, but then came the sound. Wham! A flak shell, an 88mm burst of pure hatred, slammed into the No. 2 engine. The wing flared with fire. The propeller began to windmill, dragging the aircraft out of the formation. In the world of bomber combat, a straggler was a dead man. The German fighters, hovering like vultures, saw the Rikki-Tikki-Tavi lose speed. They pounced. Eugene was working the triggers frantically. He saw 2 Messerschmitts coming in low. He felt the impact of bullets hitting the fuselage forward of him. The intercom went dead. The voices of his friends, the navigator, the waist gunners, the radio operator, were replaced by a terrifying, hollow silence. Then, the killing blow arrived. A German pilot, likely a veteran of the Eastern Front, lined up his cannon. He didn't aim for the engines this time. He aimed for the waist, the thin section of the B-17 just behind the ball turret. Eugene felt the plane lurch violently. He heard a sound that haunted his dreams for the next 70 years, the screech of structural failure. Imagine a giant taking a tin can and twisting it until it snaps. That was the Rikki-Tikki-Tavi. Under the immense stress of the dive and the cannon fire, the B-17's fuselage buckled. Eugene watched through his small plexiglass window as the main body of the plane, the cockpit, the engines, the wings where his friends were still struggling, simply pulled away. One moment, he was part of a 10-man crew. The next, he was the sole occupant of a 20-foot metal tube. He was falling. But he wasn't falling like a stone. The tail section of a B-17 has a vertical stabilizer and 2 horizontal elevators. It's essentially a giant dart. As it broke away, it began to tumble and spin end over end. Eugene looked at his parachute. It was right where he left it, but it was shredded. 20mm shrapnel had torn through the silk. It was a useless rag. He was 24,000 feet up. He had no way out. He was trapped in the back of a falling metal coffin, spinning through the clouds at over 120 miles per hour. Most people would black out from the G-forces, but Eugene's Wisconsin farm boy grit kicked in. He realized that as the tail section spun, his guns were still pointed at the sky, and the Germans, they were still coming. This is the part of the story that historians found hard to believe until it was corroborated by German pilots themselves. As the tail section of the Rikki-Tikki-Tavi plummeted toward the German countryside, Eugene Moran was pinned to his seat by centrifugal force. Blood from a shrapnel wound in his arm was splattering against the glass. He was dizzy, nauseous, and facing certain death. But then, a shadow crossed his vision. A German pilot, curious to see the wreckage or perhaps wanting to confirm the kill, dove down alongside the falling tail. He likely expected to see a corpse or an empty, shattered room. Instead, he looked into the eyes of Eugene Moran. Eugene didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handles of his twin .50s. As the tail section rotated like a top, he timed his bursts. Every time the spinning wreckage pointed his guns toward the German fighter, he unleashed a wall of lead. Think about the sheer defiance of that moment. You are falling 4 miles to your death. You have no parachute. Your plane is in pieces, and yet you are still the gunner. The German pilot must have been terrified. Tracers from a dead plane began stitching holes across his wings. He banked away in shock. Eugene didn't stop. He saw another fighter and opened fire again. He was fighting a war on his way to the grave. But the ground was coming. The air was getting thicker, warmer. The screaming wind through the open end of the fuselage was deafening. Eugene stopped shooting when the guns finally ran dry, where the G-forces became too much. He braced himself. He wrapped his arms around his head and tucked into a ball, wedging himself against the heavy ammunition boxes. He watched the patchwork of German fields rushing up to meet him. 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet, 2,000 feet. He closed his eyes. He thought of the farm in Wisconsin. He thought of the quiet mornings and the smell of the hay. He prepared for the lights to go out. But the dart shape of the tail section did something miraculous. Because of the stabilizers, it didn't hit nose first. It began to flat spin, creating a small amount of drag. It was still hitting at nearly 100 miles per hour, but it wasn't the 120 miles per hour of a terminal velocity drop. Then came the trees. The tail section slammed into a dense forest of pine trees. The branches acted like a series of giant shock absorbers. Snap, crash, thud. The metal screeched as it tore through the canopy, shedding speed with every broken limb. Finally, with a bone-jarring impact that threw Eugene against the steel bulkhead, the wreckage hit the frozen ground and slid to a halt. Silence. Eugene Moran opened his eyes. He smelled pine needles and burnt cordite. He was alive. When the tail section of the Rikki-Tikki-Tavi finally stopped sliding through the frozen dirt of a forest near Syke, Germany, it was no longer a piece of a proud American bomber. It was a twisted, smoking heap of junk. Inside, Eugene Moran lay broken. The impact had been catastrophic. Both of his forearms were shattered compound fractures where the bone had punched through the skin. His ribs were crushed, making every shallow breath feel like a bayonet twist in his chest. But the most horrifying injury was his head. A piece of the fuselage had scalped him, tearing away a section of his skull and exposing his brain to the freezing German air. He lay there, smelling the pine and the blood, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, he heard the crunch of boots on snow. German soldiers and local civilians arrived at the crash site. They had just watched American bombs turn their nearby factories into craters. They were angry, terrified, and looking for someone to blame. They found Eugene. They dragged him out of the wreckage, ignoring his screams of agony. They didn't see a hero. They saw a terrorflieger, a terror flyer. He was thrown onto a wooden cart. There were no blankets, no morphine, and no mercy. As the cart bounced over the frozen ruts of the country roads, Eugene drifted in and out of a dark delirium. He was taken to a local military facility where German officers looked at him with a mix of disgust and pity. To them, he was a dead man walking. His wounds were already turning a sickly shade of purple. Gangrene, the silent killer of the battlefield, was setting in. For 2 days, Eugene was left on a cold concrete floor. The Germans weren't going to waste their precious medical supplies on a dying enemy when their own soldiers were bleeding out on the Eastern Front. He was 19 years old, 4 miles from the sky, and dying in a dark room surrounded by the enemy. He should have been a footnote in history, one more name on a casualty list. But fate had one more miracle waiting in the form of 2 men who wore the same chains he did. On the 3rd day, Eugene was moved to a prisoner of war hospital. It wasn't a hospital in any modern sense. It was a warehouse of the wounded. The German doctors performed a quick triage. They looked at Eugene's exposed brain and his blackening, shattered arms and gave him a 0% chance of survival. They moved him to the dying ward. But this facility held a secret weapon: 2 Serbian doctors who had been captured by the Nazis. These men were prisoners themselves, forced to work in horrific conditions with almost no tools. When they saw the young American airmen, they didn't see a hopeless case. They saw a challenge to the darkness of the war. They decided to operate. The surgery lasted 7 hours. There was no general anesthesia. The Germans wouldn't provide it. They used local numbing agents that barely scratched the surface of the pain. Eugene had to be conscious or semi-conscious for much of it. Imagine the sound of a saw on your own bone, the smell of your own cauterized flesh, while you are pinned down by men who speak a language you don't understand. The Serbian doctors were magicians of the macabre. They cleaned the infection out of his arms with primitive antiseptics. They set his bones using bits of wire and metal pins they had scavenged. Most incredibly, they cleaned the bone fragments from his brain and fitted a crude metal plate over the hole in his skull. When the sun rose the next morning, the doctors were exhausted and Eugene was in a coma. His fever spiked to 104 degrees. He was reliving the fall, screaming in his sleep about fighters at 6 o'clock. The Serbian doctors stayed by his side, wiping his brow with cold rags. They knew that if he could survive the next 72 hours, he might just live to see the end of the war. Against every law of medicine, the Wisconsin farm boy woke up. He looked at the doctors, and though he couldn't speak, they knew. The man who fell 4 miles was staying on this earth. 6 weeks later, Eugene Moran was stable enough to be moved into the main prison system. He was sent to Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania. This was a place designed to break the spirit. It was a forest of barbed wire and machine gun towers. Eugene arrived a shell of a man. His arms were in heavy wooden splints. The metal plate in his head felt like a frozen coin pressed against his brain, causing migraines that would last for days. He was surrounded by thousands of other Allied airmen, pilots who had been shot down, navigators who had lost their way. In the camp, the primary enemy wasn't the guards, it was hunger. The rations were a joke. Kriegi bread made of sawdust and flour, and a thin, watery soup made from rotten turnips. Eugene, who had once been a strong 150-pound farm boy, began to wither away. But even in the dirt of the Stalag, the mystery cotton of his survival kept him going. He became a legend among the prisoners. "That's the kid," they would whisper, "the one who came down in the tail." Men would come to his bunk just to see if he was real. Eugene rarely spoke about the Rikki-Tikki-Tavi. To talk about it was to remember the 9 men who didn't have a tail section to ride down. He carried the guilt of the survivor. Why him? Why did the Wisconsin boy get the miracle while the others got the fire? This silence started in the camps and would last for 60 years. But the worst part of his journey hadn't even started. The year was 1944, and the Russian army was beginning to scream toward the German border from the east. The Nazis were getting desperate. They didn't want the Red Army to liberate the POWs, so they decided to move them on foot. In February 1945, the guards at Stalag Luft 4 kicked open the barrack doors. "Raus! Raus!" Eugene Moran was forced out into the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. Temperatures were 20 degrees below zero. This was the beginning of the Black March, an 86-day trek across the heart of a dying Germany. There were 6,000 men in Eugene's column. They had no winter coats, no boots, and no food. They walked 15 to 20 miles a day through knee-deep snow. If a man fell behind, the guards would shoot him and leave him in the ditch. Eugene's improperly healed bones ached with every step. The metal plate in his head conducted the cold directly into his skull, making it feel like his brain was freezing. They slept in barns filled with manure to stay warm. They ate raw potatoes they dug out of the frozen ground. They drank melted snow contaminated with typhus. An estimated 1,500 men died on that march. They died of pneumonia, of exhaustion, and of the guards' bullets. But Eugene Moran kept his eyes on the back of the man in front of him. One foot, then the other. He had survived a 4-mile fall. He wasn't going to let a German road be his end. By April, the column had covered nearly 600 miles. Eugene was a ghost. He weighed 93 pounds. His ribs stood out like a bird's cage. He was covered in lice and filth. But on April 26th, near the Elbe River, the sound of the guards shouting was replaced by a different sound, the rumbling of American tanks. The 104th Infantry Division had arrived. The guards threw down their rifles. Eugene Moran, the boy who fell from the sky, had finally landed in the arms of freedom.